Turkisavach, ja. I have a secret. I love the Age of Sail. I love the Age of Sail. I just did that little trick earlier to just be weird. Hope you liked it. But I do love the Age of Sail. And today what I want to do is I want to talk about an elevator pitch that I published earlier as a blog post. And the elevator pitch is for a National Museum of Sail. And it's basically a Smithsonian museum dedicated to the history of sail, focusing on the American history, of course, because it's a Smithsonian museum, but also extending back all the way in history to the Stone Age. Now, this might seem like a niche subject, but the history of sailing, it does cover so much of human history, and it's the thing that brought all of the peoples around the world together in one way or another. I mean, it's the thing that allowed the Polynesians to explore and to colonize one of the largest areas that any people has ever explored and colonized. It's a huge part of human history, and more as we learn more about how deep into our history and even into the Stone Age, sailing has actually affected human migration. It's also a huge chunk of our vocabulary. I mean, there are books out there, and I may post a few names of books here. One of them is Peter D. Jean's Ship to Shore, a dictionary of everyday words and phrases derived from the sea. And that book is thick, and it just details the phrases in just one language, English, my language, that are derived from sailing. So it's sail, the Age of Sail, and by that I know normally you mean the age of exploration of European sail, but really the Age of Sail in a larger sense extends all the way back deep into human history. And so I don't think it's necessarily a niche subject. But why a museum of sail specifically in the United States? Well, there was a great transformation in the culture, politics, and economy of the United States in the mid-1800s. And it goes largely unrecognized. I mean, I bet you didn't learn about this in any history class. But we went, during that period, from an outward-looking, maritime, pre-industrial, mostly pre-industrial, or maybe proto-industrial, sail-driven country to an inward-looking, terrestrial, industrial, and rail-driven country. That was when the railroads. So we stopped looking out to where sail was taking us, and we started to look in where rail was bringing us together. It's a huge shift in the American consciousness. And rather than wind riders working with nature, which is what you have to do when you sail, we began to see ourselves as nature's steam-powered conquerors. And this occurred on the sea as well, with the advent of steam-powered ships. The romance of the sea was replaced with the romance of the West, which is the land, and the setting of our dreams and our fantasies and our fictions became less watery than arid. It was a gigantic shift, and because of this shift, the American sense of foreignness became less defined by what was across the Atlantic in Europe and more by what was across the deserts in Mexico and south into the rest of Latin America, or what was north into Canada. We became more consciously American at this time, and a little bit more isolationist. And that metamorphosis was sealed in the Civil War, which was a conflict not against others outside of our country, but against ourselves, wherein more Americans died in that war than in both World Wars and Vietnam combined. You can also see in the tragedy of the life and career of Herman Melville, who was a great prophet of American literature. He wrote maritime novels at the very moment that the nation was turning away from the sea, this period during the mid-1800s. And he enjoyed a revival of popularity, only after the romance of the West had started to burn itself out, in the early 1900s, and America was forced out of its isolation by events across the sea in Europe. So you can see how this sort of this dynamic between an outward-looking sail sea vision of what America is and this inward-looking rail land vision of what America is. It was a gigantic cultural transformation in the 1800s, and it's just simply not. We don't really address it very well. Now, I would claim that there are actually three great periods of American history that are driven by this change in transportation. Of course, there's the age of sail and the age of rail, which I've been talking about. But then, of course, the age of rail finally gave way to the great American century of the airplane and the automobile, which is strange because the ages of sail and rail were kind of this dichotomy between water and earth. But then when air came in, the automobile kind of kept a little bit of the earth in there, and it became just an alternative to rail. But still, there was that aeronautic aspect to it that sort of give it's almost an elemental quality. These three ages, and each one of these, I think, deserves its own museum. But I'm going to focus on the longest of these ages, and the one that kind of brings America into being, and as sort of a culmination of this long history of sail reaching back into the Stone Age. And it's the Age of Sail. It's the National Museum of Sail is what I'm calling it. Now, the museum would be designed to mimic a sailing ship, and I'll put up an image of what I'm thinking of. It's a sort of model with very simplified masts, and the truncated masts would feature yards on which banners could be draped like sails, and the mainmast could also contain an elevator to a crow's nest at the top, providing a very unique view of Washington, D.C. This would be more or less scenic depending on the placement of the museum, but most of the places, as I'll show you some of the places I think it could be placed, all of the placements are going to provide a grand view of the major buildings and monuments of D.C. And the verisimilitude with a real ship, of course, that would be limited. The decks of real tall ships are curved like this, and that would be problematic in a standing structure. Also, the boarding, rather than boarding through the upper deck, which is what you do on an actual ship, visitors would enter through a doorway along the port side of the museum, of course, as in a real ship, but it would be lower on the ship because you can't expect people to go up and then back down into a museum. Otherwise, I would try to make it. I would want it to be as much as evocative of a real ship, of a real sailing ship as it could be. Now, there would be a central elevator in the main lobby, which would be the same elevator that travels up to the crow's nest. And there would be ample spaces all around this central space, and for exhibits needing a lot of vertical room. So the central space would have fewer floors than the outer parts, simply so that you could have exhibitions there that would need that vertical space. And hallways would lead away from the main lobby fore and aft to permanent exhibits on things like the pre-American history of sea travel, going all the way back to the Stone Age, as I've talked. The mechanics of sailing and navigation and shipbuilding, how to rig, and the knots that are put there, and all the little tools and mechanisms that make a ship work. The role of the infamous triangle trade. You can't talk about the history of sail without talking about how it enabled slavery, and that would definitely need to be addressed. And American naval history, so the military aspects before the advent of steam power, of course. You'd have a section on piracy, which would probably be pretty popular. Maritime law and maritime commerce, all of which sort of tie into piracy. And there would also have to be some parts of the museum that would address life aboard ship during the Age of Sail. So you would, the clothing that people wore, the cuisine, if you could call it that, the health issues, work routines, the culture aboard ships, that sort of thing would need to be addressed. Now, atop the museum, on not up at the crow's nest, but just on the top of the museum, would be a captain's cabin restaurant with both a weather deck and outside or inside seating, the weather deck being outside. That's why it's called a weather deck. There would be a forecastle shop in the forecastle, which is what forecastle means, for souvenirs, books, and things like that, and an outdoor display event area on the waist, which is the middle part of the weather deck, around the mainmast, where things could happen. If you wanted to have a little festival outside or something, you could have it out there, and it would be on top of the museum and out in the open air. So if it was a sunny day, people could have set up little booths and stuff, and that, something fun at the museum to make it less just a stodgy affair. You could have a foods of the sea, or foods from around the world that were connected to America by sail. And it would, you can just imagine that all of the different things that could be done up there. Now, the base of the museum would be surrounded by a water feature. I'm going to put it up an image of what this water feature would look like. It's basically an endless pool type of mechanism. So water would be pumped from the front of the pool toward an intake at the aft of the museum. And it would break around the building itself to create the illusion of movement through water. That sort of bow wake that's at the front of a ship would also be at the front of the museum. And the entrance bridge that people would come in would cross over this water feature. Staff, of course, could enter through an underground garage with an entrance that was located away from the building's public perimeter, simply to let them not have to deal with crowds and stuff like that, and not to break up the image of the sailing ship. Now, where could we put it? I considered a lot of places, and I'm going to go ahead and tell you that the graphic that I made for this was made some time ago. So I'll discuss one of the things that has happened since I designed this graphic that would cause one of my 4 locations to not quite be. It wouldn't be possible anymore. But I have a nearby one that I'll substitute. The first one, and as you can see on the graphic, I've marked all of the major sites. I've got the Capitol marked, and the Washington Monument marked, and the Lincoln Memorial, and the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial, the FDR Memorial, Jefferson Memorial. You can see them all marked here on this graphic. And the museums that are along the mall are in those green rectangles. Now, in East Potomac Park, which is the little island that the Jefferson Memorial is on, it's the site number 1. It faces the river, and it's an ideal spot. This really is my favorite spot, I think. This site is currently a small corner of the East Potomac Golf Course, and this corner, the golf course just dominates East Potomac Park. That island you see is mostly golf course. But the museum would take up a very tiny corner of that. That would probably be the one sticking point, is that's an historic golf course, and a lot of people wouldn't want to give up any space. But it would be a perfect place for the National Museum of Sail. It would be right on the river, and it would be near this. There's this metro station that has been proposed over and over again, and it's marked on there. It's on the yellow line, so there's a little yellow line on the thing that shows where the bridge is. And right at the end of it, right before the bridge or the yellow line goes into a tunnel leading to L'Enfant Plaza, people have said we should put a station there so that people can get off there and visit the Jefferson Memorial and all the sites around the tidal pool. That may or may not happen, but if the National Museum of Sail were built at this site number 1, that would be another reason to have a new station there. Now, the selling points for this site, of course, the proximity to the Jefferson Memorial and the potential metro station, proximity to the main channel of the Potomac, which would permit a dock annex so that tall ships could dock at this museum, which would be perfect. And it would be a location downriver from the bridges that are associated with 14th Street, because tall ships cannot get past those bridges. Those bridges are just too low. Now, if the main site I have, if for some reason that can't be done, the site 1A, which is marked in pink, and that would face the new wharf development across the channel there. This would also still be close to the Jefferson Memorial, a little bit further away, but one thing that you could do is you could have a ferry from the wharf straight over to the museum. And of course, tall ships could still pull up to the museum if it were in this location. It would just simply be, they would be pulling up at an opposite side of the island. So those are my two primary favorite locations. But you can see my second location is in West Potomac Park, which is the one, it's directly behind the FDR Memorial. And it would have a perspective of the tidal pool. You'd be able to see the Potomac and the tidal pool, which is kind of cool because it would give the museum the an almost an illusion of being on the open water. Now currently there are public sports fields here, and some people might protest the taking these public sports fields, but there's no place that you can put anything in DC that something doesn't have to be removed. It's also close to the Jefferson Memorial and any station that might crop up there. So that would be another reason for that station. It's a nice one. The only problem, of course, is that it's beyond bridges. That means that you wouldn't be able to bring you wouldn't be able to bring tall ships up to the museum itself, and that's the one thing that I think is the main detriment to that position. So let's move on to possible site number 3. Now here's the one that's a problem, because it used to be that near the southwest duck pond there was an open space on 4th Street bordering on DC government buildings. Now that spot has since been taken up by some developments, some apartment buildings that have commercial space in the bottom, but there's still, on the opposite side of 4th Street, there's still an open field that might be able to fit the museum. Now this particular site, of course, it's away from the water. You could still have like an annex at the wharf for tall ships to tie up to, but it's a little bit less ideal because it's away from the water. It is, however, very close to the waterfront metro. That would be a bonus, but otherwise, I think that this would be a less than ideal spot. So the last spot, which is number 4, it's closer to the Anacostia. It's near Buzzard Point, next to Fort McNair. There's some open space there. Despite being within walking distance to Nationals Park, which is marked there with a W, and to the Titanic Memorial, which is at the south end of the wharf, it's in a very cluttered industrial neighborhood, which isn't the best place to have a museum. However, there are some developers looking at that area. Who knows what they're going to do? There seems to be a general sense that the developments at Navy Yard around the Nationals Park and the developments around the wharf need to be tied together somehow. And if the National Museum of Sail were placed in this spot near Buzzard Point, that would help that happen. Still, I don't think it's as ideal as site number 1, but it's one of the places that I've thought would be a decent place for such a museum. Now, what sort of events would happen at a National Museum of Sail? Well, of course, there'd be archaeology tours, traveling exhibits of shipwrecks and other maritime artifacts, ancient nautical artwork, port ruins, pirate treasures, Bellamy's treasure, which they've been digging up in New England along the coast. That sort of thing, when they were making the rounds, National Museum of Sail would be an obvious natural choice for displaying these items. Tall ship visits, as I've talked about, and I've talked about the obstacles and the opportunities for tall ship visits. This would be something that could happen at such a museum. A pirate festival. Now, what else do you have to say? That would be extremely popular. People would just, it's fun for the whole family, and it could draw off-season Ren Fair enthusiasts to the museum for just, some period at the museum when instead of the serious scientific work and educational work at a museum, just like a week where people could just have fun with the stereotypes and the the popular culture vision of the Age of Sail. But there could be also serious pirate exhibits. They could show pirate movies in the museum theater, and there would be classes teaching piratey skills. You can actually have people there are serious reenactors. I know that among historical reenactors, the pirate guys tend to get a bad rep, but there really are serious reenactors who really try to get into the period culture and the period technologies, and having those guys around to sort of balance out the more fun aspects would be something that could happen. Book signings and book releases for maritime related books could be held at the museum, whether they were academic or fictional. And of course there could be a, in beyond just the films that could be shown all the time, there could be an actual maritime film festival where you could show, more fantasy stuff like the Pirates of the Caribbean, but also stuff that was more realistic like Master and Commander. And a maritime film festival would be a huge draw, I think. Lastly, but not leastly, you could have Naval and Coast Guard ceremonies at the museum. Up on the weather deck, the waist of the museum would provide a fantastic space for promotions, retirements, and other ceremonies for U.S. Navy and Coast Guard personnel. And off-hour events at the captain's cabin for military members could also be arranged. And having events like this in the context of this huge expanse of naval history would, add so much punch and just gravitas to these events. So that's my pitch for a National Museum of Sail. It's something that I think has been long overdue. Like I said, there should also be a museum of rail and a museum of there already is a museum to address aeronautics, the Aeronautics and Space Museum. But we need where is the Museum of the Automobile? I mean, how can America not have a Smithsonian Museum of the Automobile? But I address the National Museum of Sail because that's just something special to me, and someone who's really into trains. I'm sure they're like, wow, if that went through, I would love to work on the National Museum of Rail or the National Museum of the Automobile. And which would of course not just from Henry Ford and onward, but would go into making automobiles more green and Tesla and self-driving cars and that entire spectrum. So it's three ideas that I'm just addressing one aspect of, and I think that it's time that we did have museums that really went into how important transportation is in human life and how it's affected us so much in so many parts of of how we live. Anyway, John Nelson Leith, I want to thank you, and just like, share, subscribe to this channel for more Thoughts of Leith.